Ancient Empires of Mesopotamia, a history of power and conflict. Sometime around 2400 BCE, a new sort of ruler rose to prominence in the city of Lagash. Urukagina, usurping the throne during a time of internal dissatisfaction, had a new approach to ruling his subjects, one that was less about fear or worship and more about love. Urukagina appeared to have one thing in mind: to reform the city of Lagash so dramatically that his people would love him with all their hearts. Whether his motive was one of securing power, or that he genuinely wanted to ensure his people were living happy, comfortable lives, it is hard to say. What is abundantly clear, however, is that upon his accession, the bureaucracy in Lagash was corrupt and crumbling. Taxes were high. The previous ruler had confiscated large amounts of land for himself and his family. There were additional charges to almost everything, from divorces to the shearing of sheep. And those additional charges were pocketed by the ruler and his ministers. Even burial rites came at an absurd cost: over 400 loaves of bread and 7 jars of beer paid to the priest and his assistant. Needless to say, the people were not happy. Urukagina's legitimacy as a ruler was based on the rescue of his people from the domination of both the temple and his predecessor. He uncovered and put a stop to corruption throughout the bureaucracy, dedicating his time not to conquests and regional domination, but the well-being of his subjects. It seems probable that Urukagina was a good man, well-loved and respected, and would have had a long and successful reign ahead of him, were it not for the ambitions of another new ruler in the neighboring city of Umma. Lagash of Umma was an ambitious man. Umma and Lagash had long been rivals, engaging in warfare originally over disputed territory, and had traded blows often over the past century. It was during a lull in conflict, however, while Urukagina was reforming his city, that Lagash saw an opportunity to build up his forces and strike a decisive blow. Lagash had often bested Umma, and it was perhaps this bitterness that drove forward the city's new ruler. The story of Urukagina goes to show that simply being a good ruler does not protect you from conquest and destruction. Urukagina's reign over Lagash lasted only a short 8 years. The fall of Lagash was condemned by many. Urukagina had been considered a good man, and Lagash was cursed by many for his crushing blow over his rival. Krivacek, 2010, records a lament from the time. The ruler of Umma has set fire to the temple of Antasura. He has carried away the silver and the lapis lazuli. He has shed blood in the temple of the goddess Nanshi. He has carried away the precious metal and the precious stones. The man of Umma, by despoiling Lagash, has committed a sin against the god Ningirsu. May the hand that he dared to raise against Ningirsu be cut off. There was no fault in Urukagina, king of Lagash. May Nisaba, the goddess of Lagash, ruler of Umma, make him bear his mortal sin upon his neck. Page 100. Lagash was merely the beginning. Lagash went on to conquer not only his neighbor, but also the cities of Kish, Nippur, Larsa, and Uruk. He took the latter as his capital and declared hegemony over the states of Sumer. While his claims of controlling the entirety of the Fertile Crescent appear greatly exaggerated, there is little doubt that Lagash was the catalyst for something great. Little did he know that upon deposing the ruler of Kish, he laid the foundations for the first empire in human history. Sargon of Akkad. By this point in Mesopotamian history, there had been temple rulers, Lugaline, monarchs ruling from strength and fear, and even a monarch who sought the approval and love of his people. The trouble with all of these systems of leadership is that they could only succeed over a limited scope. Both love and fear go a long way, but perhaps not so far as to bind together a vast empire. As such, the regional rule of most previous kings had been limited to a selection of cities over a small area. Following the fall of Kish to Lagash, however, a new leader rose to prominence, and with him came a new form of leadership, one based on hero worship rather than fear or love. This man was Sargon, and he founded the first empire in human history. When one thinks of an empire, several things come to mind. Firstly, we think of emperors, usually monarchical rulers who appear in higher stead than a simple king or queen. Secondly, we think of vast swathes of land under the rule of a single governing body. The one thread that runs through all historical empires is that it contains not merely one culture or people, but many different groups, all brought together under a single administration. The Roman Empire ruled over many different cultures across Europe, Africa, and Asia. The Mongol Empire ruled an even greater number, stretching from the Far East to Asia Minor, and ruling over China, Persia, and the steppe cultures. The British Empire ruled over even more cultures and peoples, stretching around the entire globe. To be the ruler of an empire is to rule over people who are not your own, alongside those who are. Sargon was believed to be the cupbearer to the Usurping who ruled over Kish before the conquest of Lagash. Due to his quick rise following the deposition of his king, chances are that Sargon had long nurtured a desire for power. The role of cupbearer was one of great importance and would have provided Sargon with the connections and funds needed to entice a considerable number of loyal followers. Whether he seized power and marched south under the guise of revenge, or if he was simply opportunistic, is difficult to say. Regardless of his apparent motivations, however, Sargon knew what he was doing, and before long he had captured Uruk and Lagash. It was the conquest of Uruk that brought Sargon into power. However, despite vanquishing his opponent, he also had to contend with many Sumerian cities attempting to establish their freedom following the original conqueror's death. Freed from the yoke of Lagash, they hoped to maintain independence, and saw the opportunity to do so. Sargon proved an efficient conqueror, however, and before long he had Sumer in the palm of his hand. In fact, not satisfied with ruling only Sumer, Sargon set about conquering neighboring territories, bringing the southern Sumerians and the northern Semites together under a single administration. He set out to build a vast empire, spreading far beyond the two rivers. It is said that he was victorious in 34 battles, even seizing the lands of the Elamites on the far bank of the Tigris, the city of Mari in the north, and even pushing into the lands of the Amorites, whose connection to Mesopotamia would become significant hundreds of years later, as would the small city of Ashur, conquered on the northern banks of the Tigris. It is even suggested that Sargon of Akkad may have ventured into Asia Minor, although any success in the region would have been limited. Sargon himself was in fact a Semite, as opposed to a Sumerian, but as emperor over both peoples, he walked a lonely path between cultures. It was perhaps as a Semite, living among Sumerians, that Sargon had developed the mindset required to rule over many, the ability to understand people of various backgrounds and cultures. Whatever the case may be, Sargon knew that to establish himself as a new kind of ruler, to separate himself from both Ur-Zababa and Lagash, and to appeal not merely to the subculture of Kish but people the world over, he was required to create a new center of power. Akkad, the Semitic name for the city, it was called Agada in Sumerian, founded by Sargon upon the establishment of his new empire, was to become the center of the Mesopotamian world. It was from Akkad, not only that the name of the empire was derived, Akkadian Empire, but also that of the language spoken by many of its people, a language that was still spoken by inhabitants of the area many years later under the Assyrian and Babylonian empires. For widespread appeal, Sargon was required to rethink kingship. The people of a nation or a city are typically bound to their ruler by a shared culture, language, or priority. To rule over many, a ruler had to establish themselves as universally acceptable, transcending typical ideas of belonging and culture. It could be a very lonely undertaking, requiring a lot of psychological fortitude to no longer see yourself as part of a pre-established group. To make others see you that way as well requires a new kind of legitimacy, one that appeals to all. The foundation of Akkad was the beginning of this separation, but it was to continue. Sargon had to cultivate an image of himself as a heroic figure, worthy of adulation and worship. While remaining a man, Sargon had to step into the role of a god, founding a city himself as opposed to inheriting one from a deity. Even his name was fabricated, meaning true king. His true name remains unknown. He created a backstory that accentuated his humble origins and avoided any particular political affiliations. In a story reminiscent of that of Moses, yet occurring much earlier, Sargon was said to have been conceived in secret by a priestess, and then set upon a river in a basket of rushes, bore downstream until discovered by Aki, who raised him. Regarded by later generations as semi-divine, Sargon's name was even called upon by later rulers to provide a sense of legitimacy to their rule. In fact, Sargon still offers a sense of legitimacy to this very day. In 1990, during the International Babylon Festival, Iraqi President Saddam Hussein celebrated his 53rd birthday in his home village with lavish festivities, owing more than a little to the origin story of the great Akkadian emperor. A wooden cabin was wheeled into the street, before which numerous people dressed in ancient Mesopotamian costumes prostrated themselves as the door opened to reveal a baby in a basket floating down a stream. The baby was representative of Hussein, but it called on the legitimacy offered by a connection to Sargon of Akkad. The longevity of Sargon's importance serves to demonstrate just how significant he was in the history not only of Mesopotamia, but of the world as a whole, providing a model for future nations and empires thousands of years later.